Okay, well, we are about to embark on our opening panel. I'm just going to wait for our opening panelists to come up to the front. The title of our opening panel is Intersectionality, Where We Have Been and Where We Are Now. Oh, and I'm so happy to see Jessica. Jessica is on their opening panel and just arrived from the airport, so welcome. So on our opening panel, we have Rita Dhamoon from the Department of Political Science at the University of Victoria, Ange-Marie Hancock from Political Science and Gender Studies at the University of Southern California, and Jessica Danforth, who's the Executive Director of the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. And the moderator of our session is Ruth Zambrana from Women's Studies at the University of Maryland. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Good morning, and welcome again, all of you. We open or continue our conference with three distinguished panelists who we hope will help to frame the 2 days that we have together. Dr. Hill Collins has already begun the interrogation of intersectionality, and our panelists will continue to inform us on the development of the field over the last 25 years. They will answer key questions on the intellectual trajectory of intersectionality theory, current theoretical debates, and its transnational potential. I want to provide a very brief description of their scholarship of activities, although it does not do their work justice. I will briefly tell you who they are. We'll start with Dr. Rita Dhamoon, is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Victoria. She came to intersectionality inspired by path-breaking women of color activists and academics. Some of her recent publications include Identity Difference Politics, How Difference is Produced and Why It Matters, 2009, Considerations on Mainstreaming Intersectionality in the Political Research Quarterly, and lastly, Why the Theory and Practice of Intersectionality Matter to Health Research and Policy, co-authored with Elena Hankivsky. Name is hard. In Health Inequality and Inequities in Canada. Her current research is grounded in critical race feminism and includes a book project on Sikhs in Canada, inclusion politics, and nation building, applying intersectionality to solidarity politics between people of color and indigenous people. Why don't we start with Dr. Moon?
All right, so thank you, everybody. That's fine. Thank you. I'm going to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories, the Unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. Thank you to the elders and the drummers for their welcome. I want to do this because it's important for us to honor the people of this territory, to remind ourselves of the ongoing social struggles as we're here today, thinking about what we're doing with intersectionality on this territory, and also to honor the ongoing resurgences, not to forget that people are actually resisting where we are today. I also want to thank all the organizers. You guys have been amazing. I can appreciate how much work this takes, especially my thanks to Gemma Hunting. Where is Gemma? There's Gemma. Thank you, Gemma, for all your work. And to Alana Hankivsky. What to say about Alana? Being an ally in solidarity is hard work. Having activist friendships is hard work. It's complicated dynamics, as Alana has said to us. We don't always know how to navigate a particular relationship, so we take risks. We're prepared to be rejected, to fail. But I'm honored to have been walking this complicated path with Alana, and I want to honor the way that she walks with me as I navigate it, because she has shown up every time I get mad at white feminists. She continues to support me in my work and create spaces for me, as she's done at this conference. And part of that, in thinking about our relational differences, is the ways that it's reciprocal, right? Reciprocity occurs in different kinds of ways, so I honor that in Alana. All right, so we've been asked to think about where we have been and where are we going. And I want to begin by sort of problematizing this question that we've been invited to consider. The question assumes a we that has traveled together and is on the same path with a known destination. But as we know, the journey of intersectionality, scholarship and activism is neither new nor linear. So as I'm thinking of a we of intersectionality, I'm thinking about all the people, particularly the feminists of color and indigenous feminists, who've opened up ways of being and taking action and theorizing. I'm thinking about the women that I know that have shaped my own thinking along the way. My mother, my sisters, my aunts, my grandparents and great-grandparents. And I'm also thinking about those people that I've never met, who are very far away, but in some senses never far away. Patricia Hill Collins, who I've never met, but who, of course, I've been working with in my own head for years. Bell Hooks, I've been having conversations with for years. Gloria Anzaldúa, Andrea Smith, and others. So in the journey of a we, where we are looking back to where we have been, there is necessarily, of course, those who are not part of that journey of intellectual remembering. The variously positioned women, trans, queer, indigenous, refugee, migrant folks that are not here today, but of course, who are also not absent. So what I want to do is offer you, and I think I have 10, 15 minutes, so I'm going to talk really quickly, is an attempt to interpolate where we have been through as activists and scholars of intersectionality through a cacophony of conversations, some virtual, some real, and think about the ways in particular how the where we have been question invites us to reflect on the theoretical, the conceptual, the empirical, the institutional, and political. And then I'm going to talk about the second question a little bit in terms about where, for me, intersectionality scholarship is now. So I'm going to go really quick, and this will be familiar to many of you. When we're thinking about where intersectionality scholarship has taken us theoretically, we of course know that it's focused on more than one dimension of analysis at multiple levels, right? So it's not about the reducible aspects of our different lives, that there's been an anti-essentialist impulse that's informed the ways that we think about difference, particularly around the category of woman, which also needs to be troubled when we're thinking about the scholarship on transgendering, right? So there's a kind of a complicated relationship there. We also need to think about the ways in which theoretically intersectionality work has allowed us to think about the different levels of life, the individual, the group, the social and systemic levels of life. Intersectionality, of course, has been much preoccupied with focusing on identities and categories. So, I'm a brown woman, thinking about race and gender. For me, the work of intersectionality is much more powerful when we think about it in terms of processes such as racialized gendering, and we think about systems of power such as patriarchal white supremacy. But those are some of the theoretical issues that have come to the forefront through intersectionality. Conceptually, of course, the very concept of intersectionality has been in conversation with other kinds of concepts, from intersectionality to interlocking, to multiple jeopardy, to discrimination within discrimination, multiple consciousness, multiplicity, multiplex epistemologies, translocational positionality. And of course, there are some scholars who don't use any of those terms, but are talking about the multiplicities of existence. Sexual Conquest by Andrea Smith really strikes me as something that speaks to intersectionality scholarship, but she doesn't use that language. So can we claim that as being intersectional scholarship? But that is important in terms of thinking about the different conceptions of differences. Empirically, of course, we've seen this rich body of work that's really thought about the margins and lived experiences and knowledge, the epistemology, the knowledge of people on the margins who are able to speak for themselves and talking about their own kinds of differences. There's now numerous documented case studies, identities across different time and space that's trying to put forward ways for us to conceptualize these multiple ways of the ways in which power is organized. The focus on race, class, and gender, of course, was the sort of groundwork of intersectionality, but certainly we've seen scholarship that now also thinks about disability, transgendering, homo-nationalism, right? It's gone beyond the race, class, gender trinity, but I also want to note that this trinity has been important for some reason, right? There's been a response to the ways in which law, for example, has been organized, and so the relevance of race, class, and gender is not without a political context. Institutionally, as you see, I'm going to go really fast. Institutionally, I think the work of intersectionality, and I want to say this both in academic and non-academic spaces, right? Non-academic spaces also do theoretical work, political work, institutional work. It's not just in academic spaces. But what intersectionality has allowed us to do is think about the ways in which there have been shifts so that more marginalized subjects are entering, for example, the academy and having to negotiate a variety of differences. And that work has challenged white and mainstream versions of those spaces. But I also want us to be cautious about the ways in which bodies are being made to disappear through intersecting forces of power, right? So we can think, for instance, just locally here about the murdered and missing Aboriginal women and how that's been appropriated by the BC government through its Opal report and used as a way to legitimize itself. But intersectionality has been institutionalized in multiple ways. It's increasingly been taught as a theoretical approach, a research paradigm with its own ontology and epistemology, a political project that many of us are engaged in, and increasingly as a policy tool, right? So this is becoming a question that's really been institutionalized in many ways through conferences, such as this one, edited books, book series, Ange-Marie Hancock, for example, is co-editing a book series on intersectionality, special issue journals. And it really raises the question of how are we thinking about mainstreaming intersectionality? It's certainly not in political science, I can tell you that much. But there are some departments that are taking this much more seriously. Gender and women's studies departments, ethnic and racial studies departments are. And should we be concerned about mainstreaming intersectionalities? For me, it's a question that I wrestle with. On the one hand, does it mean that we're entering the non-academic, the academic industrial complex, right? Is that what we want to do? Be part of that framework? Intersectionality in the non-profit industrial complex also is wrestling with how to think about intersectionality. And for me, I'm less preoccupied with this question. I'm going to think about differences in multiple ways, regardless of whether it's institutionalized or not, as I know many of you already are as well. And then politically, and this is really where I think for me, this is where intersectionality has been a place to anchor myself, both in terms of responding to the governing regimes of whiteness and patriarchy, but also in navigating very complicated relationships amongst women of color. Intersectionality has helped me in many ways to catch my breath, in the words of Torina Carrillo, and sort out my own confusions about what I should be doing and how I should be doing it, right? Those painful moments when we're thinking about relationships amongst people that we think are from our own social group. Fundamentally, intersectionality, I think, is powerful politically because it can challenge patriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist, heteronormative, ableist norms and the way that they operate together. So it's about a critique of power. That, for me, is what politically intersectionality can do. But one of the challenges that I think that we face is how intersectional claims are being made to the state that tend to assume state sovereignty as legitimate and natural, right? So when we're making claims around the particular ways that South Asian women are being taken up in health policies, for example, what are we presuming about state sovereignty, the legitimacy of Canada as a nation to make and authorize different kinds of policies when there is dispossession of Indigenous peoples on their lands? How do we think about decolonizing intersectionality? Is that even possible when we think about it intrinsically? Okay, so that's the first part, kind of where have we been now? Then the second part is where are we now? Where are we thinking in terms of the work of intersectionality, both theoretically and in practice? And while I opened up by critiquing this idea of the we, I actually want to now come back to say it's very important for us to think about where we are now. And the reason that it's important is because it allows us to think about our politics in a very place-based way. So we are on Indigenous lands, right? That where we are now is a place-based response. And so whose territory we're on does matter in places like Canada and the US. And the other part of this for me is to think about the challenges that I think intersectionality work requires us to do. And this is the part that I think the scholars such as Patricia Hill Collins has really drawn our attention to when she thought about the matrix of domination. The work of Shireen Razak in Looking White People in the Eye really draws our attention to the ways in which we need to think and act differently when we understand ourselves and understand structures of power as being relationships of penalty and privilege. This is something we still struggle with in terms of intersectionality scholarship, right? To move away from this idea of being powerful or powerless. So how do we make the shift, for example, from this kind of model, and some of you will have seen this kind of model of, I like images, this kind of model of sort of identity being separated to thinking about the ways that Crenshaw importantly helped us think about where, and I want to really note this, she's talking about systems of power. She's not talking about identities here. The ways in which patriarchy, post-colonialism, and other intersections come together and constitute something different. How do we make those shifts in a way that speaks to the multidimensionality of different levels of life, of individuals, group, and systemic levels of life, so that we can end up with something more like this? This is what intersectionality looks like in my head. And some of you will have seen me use this image before, but I keep coming back to it because I want to draw on dimensions of intersectionality, but also pull back the presuppositions of identity that underlie much intersectionality scholarship, where the focus is still on categories and identities rather than structures and processes, and where different kinds of intersections are made analogous. So race and gender, for example, are seen as the same kind of intersection, and I'm not sure that they are. So I'm drawing here now, oh, and I should just show you this. Are we connected to the internet? Are we connected to the internet? Okay. I will just take a minute just to show you this, because this is a very helpful way to think about this. Sorry, folks. Great, thank you. So that image that you saw with the crazy matrix idea, if we could make it alive, I would like to see it moving, right? This doesn't quite capture it either. It's still too linear and circular, but there's movement that we really can't capture when we're writing in this kind of text, that things shift as we're thinking about these different intersections. So how do we get at that kind of complicated, messy sense of the world? So here I've really been drawing on the work of thinking about Patricia Hill Collins' notion of the matrix of domination and reworking it in some ways, but building, I hope building on her work, to think about the ways in which intersections are connected to one another. So what's the relationship that constitutes a matrix of power? So I've been drawing on the work here of Jasbir Puar and her notion of assemblages, which she draws from Deleuze and Guattari, to speak about feelings, ontology, affect, and information that also produce a series of dispersed but mutually implicated and messy networks. As well, I've been turning to the work of Jody Bird in her book, Transit of Empire, which is really critiquing the ways in which American Indian national assertions of sovereignty, self-determination, and land disappear into US territoriality. What Jody Bird allows us to do is think about the ways in which there are interactions between the colonizers and the colonized in the US context, thank you, and the ways in which there are also vertical interactions. So what she means here is that there are different minorities' oppressions that converge and diverge. So how do colonial discourses and the settler nations operate through multiple intersections amongst different kinds of colonialisms, different kinds of arrivals, and different kinds of displacements? Okay, what does that all mean in terms of practice? So this is not this is a very big chart. So this is what it means for me right now. What I've been doing is trying to make more concrete the ways in which there are relational penalties and privileges that exist between differently situated people of color and Indigenous peoples in the context of Canada by looking at policies targeting Indigenous peoples and people of color under the Conservative government since 2006. I'm not going to talk about these policies. I have a working document if anybody's interested, but this is just a very brief list of some of the ways in which the Conservative government right now is very specifically re-regulating different positioned Indigenous peoples and differently positioned people of color. What this allows us to do when we're thinking about these kinds of policy changes as intersections that are assemblages and cacophonies of power is really undo in many ways settler nation building, the ways in which these policies and laws are producing and reproducing the settler nation. In particular, what these policies allow us to do is critique the ways in which crown sovereignty has been deemed natural. Right? These policies and changes are fostering the surrender of reserve lands with a simple majority. They're also operating by marking refugees and non-economic immigrants of color as threats to the nation. These policies are also containing bodies and identities that threaten the supremacy of gendered whiteness and the spatial boundaries of Canada through the new In Canada Secure Certificate of Indian Status cards, and refugees are being deemed irregular arrivals and automatically arrested and detained. These policies are also fostering the neoliberal exchange of capital by forcing Indigenous peoples to adopt practices of private property and resource extraction through these neoliberal policies. And that's not to say that they are doing it, but this is the mentality. And by having able-bodied economic migrants are given priority over family class, immigrants, and refugees. So what I'm trying to do is think about these relationships of penalty and privilege by going back to all of these policy changes and how we might think about the ways in which these policy changes are relative and relational. They are producing different kinds of politics of difference amongst Indigenous peoples and amongst people of color in the service of settler colonial nation building. But I'm not completely despondent, because I do think intersectionality, and this will be my final slide, intersectionality can help us navigate this politics of relationships between penalty and privilege. And this really requires us in many ways to unsettle, and I'm using that language very deliberately, unsettle different and differential relations of structural implication. There is a politics of solidarity that underlies the way in which intersectionality can direct us. We are all differently and differentially implicated in the conditions and effects of power, right? So, and what we need to do is think about how we can I don't think we can extract ourselves out of those power dynamics, but we need to think about how we're directly benefiting or by being injured by these power relationships. We need to also unsettle innocence. So how are, for example, people of color who are differently positioned implicated structurally? This is not an individual choice. The state does not need our consent to dispossess Indigenous peoples. It is doing it anyway. And we need to think about the ways in which we can unsettle ourselves as being innocent subjects when we're occupying this particular territory, so that we can see that there are limits to connection, but we can also reflect on the ways that we can engage on different protocols of building relationships in the way that Lynn was talking about it. And fundamentally, we need to unsettle the matrix of power, the assemblages, the cacophonies, the relationships between intersections, so that we understand that any liberation struggle that doesn't confront the larger matrix of power cannot undo any one part of it, for the parts have been historically operationalized interdependently. Now, this doesn't mean that liberation struggles can defy every aspect of the matrix of power. It's very hard work when you're actually doing real work to do the work that really touches on every dimension of political life. Mostly because we don't ever have full knowledge of every aspect of the matrix of power. We never have full knowledge of the relationships of penalty and privilege. But we can ask ourselves, how are issues of violence against Indigenous women, dispossession of Indigenous land, neoliberal migration policies, the ways in which the Quebec Charter has targeted Muslim women, the ways in which temporary foreign workers are being constructed in this moment in Canada when there's been challenges about the temporary foreign workers program, how can we link these so that we can unsettle the assemblages, the cacophonies, the intersections of settler nation building? So, I'll just say that I think the politics of intersectionality is both complicated, but it also gives us some normative directions to unsettle power relationships and to engage in unsettled solidarities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dhamoon, for a wonderful overview of where we have been, where we are now, and with several hints on where we need to go. Our next presenter is Dr. Ange-Marie Hancock. Dr. Hancock is an associate professor of political science and gender studies at the University of Southern California and associate director of the USC Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. She is a globally recognized scholar of the study of intersectionality. In 2005, Dr. Hancock co-founded the Intersectional Research Section of the Western Political Science Association. She is the author of The Politics of Disgust and the Public Identity of the Welfare Queen. She won 2 national awards for these books, the Du Bois Best Book Award and the Best First Book Award by the American Political Science Association. Her recent book, Solidarity Politics for Millennials, A Guide to Ending the Oppression Olympics, focuses on development of intersectional solidarity as a method of political engagement for individuals, groups, and policymakers in U.S. politics. Let us give Dr. Hancock a warm welcome.
Thank you, and I too want to add my thanks to Olana. But before I do want to also acknowledge that we are on the ceded ground of the Coast Salish people and nation. And the reason I wanted to make sure I said it too is to tell you just a bit of a story. As Dr. Zambrana just mentioned, as one of the people who's been very involved in the Western Political Science Association, we actually had our conference last year in Los Angeles. And as the local arrangements chair, I actually wanted to have an acknowledgement of the territories and the lands that we were on. But we were not, and I even engaged with Rita to see how I can find out who that nation would be and who those peoples were, and we were not able to find it. And so when we think about who's visible and who's invisible and the way in which state policies and practices continue even when well-intentioned people want to kind of participate in solidarity and recognizing that this territory has belonged to other people, it's very difficult to do so. So I want to, of course, thank Rita for her wonderful presentation, but just kind of give that kind of recognition to, even when you want to pursue solidarity, when you want to be an ally, there are state practices that push against. And so in that regard, I also want to thank Olana. And she mentioned earlier that it's been very difficult to kind of figure out mentorship structures and networking and things. And it was very much a kind of who knew who that's allowed us to come together. I met Rita at a Western Political Science Association meeting at a panel. She introduced me to Olana, who introduced me to Lynn. And if you're of a certain age, you remember those commercials that said, and so on, and so on, and so on. And so it's been a really wonderful experience. I've been coming up to Simon Fraser since about 2006 or 7. We were trying to remember when. To the point where I'm in a different hotel and I'm like, oh, I'm not in my regular hotel. Wait, I have a regular hotel in Vancouver. And so it's been really, really wonderful to do that, and also to meet who I consider the final piece of the puzzle in terms of my own intellectual history. So I had met Dr. Hill Collins several years ago at Stanford, and then I met Lynn, and then I met Bonnie Thornton-Dill, and now I've officially met the final piece, Dr. Zambrana. So it's actually a really nice opportunity to be here. I want to talk a little bit provocatively, as you can see from the title here. Is intersectionality an intellectual property that is to be owned and to be taken and, kind of protected in certain ways? Or is it a meme, if we think about from communication studies, the idea that once it is out in the ether, there is really no control that we can have over it, right? And so we can engage with our ambivalence about that. We can certainly engage with lots of anxiety about that, as you'll see in the talk. Or is it an industrial complex? So as Rita was saying, as we start to institutionalize, as we start to think about, well, no, there really is something called intersectionality, which of course implies that there's something that's not intersectionality, and how do we actually think about that and think through that? And when we enforce those boundaries, are we participating in intersectionality as an industrial complex? And so I want to talk briefly about all of that, but how I want to do that is to really think through kind of looking backwards and then looking forwards. So the first part of my talk, I want to talk a little bit about the intellectual history and go back a little bit beyond the 25 years. So I'm writing an intellectual history book, actually. And so far what I've been able to kind of do is to really identify two intellectual projects. As I'm finishing up the book this summer, I do want to travel back in history as far as possible. So far I'm back to at least Maria Miller Stewart in the 1830s, a Black woman in Connecticut, who along with some Chicana feminists in the 1970s, had actually a different contextualization and a different approach to what we might call intersectionality-like thinking, because of course it's before the actual term was coined. But again, recognizing, as Rita said, what are the politics of doing that, right? Who am I implicitly leaving out as I start to do that? And also, what am I saying by making people intersectionality-like when they may not themselves have actually thought themselves to be doing intersectionality work? But so far, and I also want to look at some treaties in Canada in particular with the First Nations that might also construct intersectionality-like thinking going back in the past centuries. But thinking through these two projects, what I've sort of tended to see is that there's kind of this dual project. So the first project has really been about remedying stigma and injustice, bringing those voices that have traditionally been invisible to the forefront, and really being able to center that in the service of remedying stigma, as psychologists might call it, or remedying injustice, as sociologists or political scientists or activists might call it. And so the second part of the intellectual project that I've seen so far has been analytical. And it really has been an effort to think through, how do we talk about categories of difference? How do we talk about intersecting oppressions or systems of power or privilege, depending on which discipline or which area of the world we might be talking about, and reconceptualizing how those categories or oppressions fit together. So instead of thinking of them, for example, in the 60s and 70s and 80s as a margin and a center, how do we think of them conceptually as fitting together, either as pieces of a puzzle, as that wonderful kind of moving image that Rita just put forward, as a matrix of domination, if we're drawing on Dr. Hill Collins's work? How do we think about how the categories fit together and relate to one another? And so then after that, we can think about intersectionality as an analytical innovation. And in that part of the talk, I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which this term and concept has traveled, and has traveled, I think, in useful but also potentially anxiety-producing and problematic ways. And so how can we kind of think through some of these issues conscientiously, but also think through them in a way that really helps us have the hard conversations we might need to have. So the first part in terms of the did it come up? Yes. The intersectional intellectual project is that the earlier work that I've been able to find really does embrace both projects. And so when we think about the idea that there started to become a debate in the past 25 years about, are you doing the official intersectionality work that has this set of normative commitments around visibility and remedying invisibility, versus are you doing the work that's more analytical and talking about relationships between categories, I've actually found that in both projects exist in some of this earliest work. And so if you're looking at the poems of Montes, for example, in the 1970s, if you're looking at the Combahee River Collective in 1977, you start to see this shift from margin center to interlocking and intersecting. So you see that analytical shift that's going on, but you also see this shift about we've been invisible, and the movements, and this is the part that I think we have to really take account of as we talk about advocacy, both later today and this morning. The move is actually also a critique of the very movements themselves that have been designed to remedy that. So when Crenshaw is talking in her Demarginalizing the Intersections article, she is talking not just about the white mainstream or the law as kind of, a tool. She's also criticizing civil rights law and civil rights activists. She's also criticizing feminist movements, right? And so it's not just a critique of the center, it's a critique of how the margins are reformulating each other, right? And that the very remedies that are being designed and put forth by people in the civil rights movement, for example, re-institutionalize or re-inscribe invisibility. And then the other things that I found is that it is far more interdisciplinary. So there was a very popular piece in 2008, I believe it came out in Feminist Studies, that was kind of taking intersectionality to task. And one of the reasons why it was such a problematic article, even as everybody was kind of buzzing about it and saying, have you read this article? Was that it really located intersectionality in history, English, and legal studies. And it did so by looking at one article by someone in legal studies, one article by someone in history, and one article in someone who works in the English area. And so again, one of the things that we've seen in the earlier work is that it's actually far more interdisciplinary than just being located in sociology in 1988 and 1989 and in critical legal studies in 1988 and 1989. The other thing that we've found as we've started to look through all of this work in the past is that it is still quite US-centric, and so we're still trying to build out the part that really sees how intersectionality-like thinking was going on, not just in the North American context. And so we've started to do that with some Nira and Floya's work, but also that there is a lot going on with regard to the international context. So you're going to see a lot of citations, particularly in the later part of the work, that is very consciously international and transnational. Because again, we need to think about how, as North American scholars or North American activists, it's very easy to kind of center ourselves here and not think about the ways that some of these concepts have traveled for decades, not just traveling now, not just traveling in the past 25 years. So I want to talk a little bit about whether or not it's possible to even claim intersectionality. As I mentioned before, there's this idea and big debate over whether or not we should be able to draw boundaries around intersectionality. Can we fix what intersectionality is? And so the images up here are literally just from a search I did last night. I've done this search before when I was preparing for a different talk 2 years ago, and I came back to see kind of what does Wikipedia say. So for those of us who teach in the audience, or even those of us who are working with youth and young people in the audience, the first thing you do when you mention a term they don't know is what are they going to do? They're going to Google it, right? Okay, and no, this talk was not sponsored by Google, but that's primarily what they're going to do, and that word has kind of entered the lexicon, as you know. And so when you go to the intersectionality page on Wikipedia, it's constantly changing. And so 2 years ago when I did this search, I saw a page that primarily talked about Leslie McCall's article from Signs in 2005. Okay. Now, I mentioned that in the talk, and I talked about the politics of that, right? When we define it as simply one person, and Leslie is a good colleague of mine, we just saw each other 2 weeks ago, but the idea here is when we fix it to a person or an individual, we end up leaving out so much of the discourse surrounding how these ideas get produced, right? So part of the reason I give you the genealogy of having met Dr. Hill Collins, of having met Lynn, of having met Bonnie, of having met Ruth, is the idea here that they've all known each other for a really long time. And not just known each other for a really long time, as in, hi, have coffee, etc., but have been conversing for a really long time and exchanging ideas. And so how do you mark that when you're just locating it with a certain single person, right? So too, for Kim Crenshaw, who's mentioned in the very first part of that Wikipedia entry, she is also part of an intellectual community that is producing knowledge. And I want to acknowledge that the two intellectual communities I've mentioned are multiracial, not simply Black, not simply women of color even. And how do we think about that when we're talking about representing intersectionality? So as I see it, there are kind of two positions. Again, they're going to sound very extreme, and I think most people are somewhere in the fluidity between the two positions. But I do want to talk about what each of these positions might claim. So for those folks who are thinking of intersectionality as intellectual property, I think it's really important that part of the conversation around intersectionality as intellectual property is a claim that it requires specific interlocutors and political commitments, that we must be committed to feminist social justice, however we might define that term, and that it should be done around certain kinds of populations, and perhaps not other kinds of populations might be the implication. The other part of this position has to do with an idea that we can and should fix who said it first, right? So we need to start with the citation list of the folks who started this first. And then the last two, I think, are particularly important and particularly provocative. I think there is a convincing claim that the citation politics renders important sectors invisible. And I wouldn't just talk about that in terms of demographics. So I wouldn't just say that it renders the Black female interlocutors, for example, invisible, though I agree with that claim. I think it also renders, as I said, transnational sectors invisible. I think it also renders interdisciplinary sectors invisible as well. So people, if you're going to do it, you cite Collins and Crenshaw, and then you go back to your field or you go back to your discipline. And so you ignore, if you're not a psychologist, all the wonderful work that Liz Cole has done, right? Or if you're not a sociologist, then you ignore legions of work that has been done in this area because you've cited Collins and Crenshaw. And so you're good. The last thing I think we need to talk about is whether or not we should set boundaries around intersectionality. The other position, of course, is in terms of if we were to think of it as a meme, something that nobody has any control over. And as I said, these are extreme positions and most people fall somewhere in between, but I think we need to talk about the fact that we fall in between. And for the meme folks, the idea would be it's ideology free, right? So you don't have to have certain political commitments to be able to use intersectionality as a tool, as an analytical framework. Of course, you do need to still do it correctly, but you don't need to have a certain ideology or set of political commitments. Second, why are we concerned about who said it first? Isn't it more important that Beyonce is talking about feminism? Isn't it more important that, Kim Kardashian is supposedly a feminist? And so again, thinking about it as something that is relatable to populations, right? In the medium and the media that is most relevant to the most or the highest number of people. The meme position also talks about influence based on the most citations. And again, for those of us who are academics in the audience, I think that's part of the disciplining influence of the institutions that we work in, right? We are judged by how many citations we have. We are judged by the way in which certain folks are given prominence and other folks' work is invisible. And then the last thing actually came up last week, which is the idea of being called multiple. So having your work or your person called multiple instead of intersectional is actually an assertion of power. So again, going back to that idea that we are differentially located, but that we all have both privilege and disadvantage, right? And so the assertion of folks who have traditionally been on the margins to then say what you're doing is not white feminist, intersectionality, because intersectionality can only be done by those of us who have experienced these certain kinds of disadvantages. Those on the, in the center or on this meme kind of position would say that's an assertion of power. So to set boundaries or to be able to say this is and this is not intersectionality, we need to step into that if we want to do it and own that as an assertion of power. Not pretend that it's coming just from a place of disadvantage or weakness. And so I want to talk a little bit about the 1970s and 80s, which is where I've been spending most of my time. I am a fangirl, so I do have this picture here of Zan and Jaina, the Wonder Twins, from the cartoon The Super Friends. And the reason why is because Zan and Jaina have actually been quite helpful to me, even though they probably will not make it into the book. They're helpful because they really kind of build out what I think are several analytical advantages of intersectionality. So if we've talked about where we've been, I want to talk a little bit briefly, and then in the Q&A we can do more about where we're going. Zan and Jaina, for example, are shapeshifters, and they're able to break mind control. But the only way that they get their power, and this is why it was so interesting to me, is through physical contact, through interaction with each other. And so I think that really is part of the heart of intersectionality as an intellectual and an analytical innovation. So when I talk about what Wonder Twin power I mean, I have in the past been accused of, or celebrated for, or somewhere in the middle, pushing what's called a paradigm intersectionality approach. And the reason why I do that is for the reasons that are on the right-hand side here. But I want to talk specifically about the idea, because when we talk about the practical applications of intersectionality, I think people really do want to figure out what are the relevant considerations if I'm designing a policy, if I'm trying to make sure that an intervention I've designed actually works. And I think the analytical purchase of paradigm intersectionality is that it helps us address problems or issues that are marked by their causal complexity. And by causal complexity, I mean simply the idea that when you have a specific outcome you're talking about, there are actually multiple paths to get there. So if we think about wanting to improve high school graduation rates for marginalized kids, if we think about naturalized citizenship as something that people take varying paths to, we really want to talk about the idea that there might be some causal complexity involved. And so there is an empirical methodology, and in the interest of time, I'm simply going to refer you to an off-print of some articles that I left out on the table if you're interested. But again, being someone who knows that we have to deal with data on some level, particularly in these applications, it's very important. There have been, of course, intersectionality-infused innovations. And so I want to refer you to the work of Ronnie Greenwood, who's a psychologist, as well as Edwina Barbosa, who works in Chicano studies and in political theory, about some of these personal aspects, right, that have been very helpful, not just to scholars, but also to activists, that we need to push past ambivalence. And there is a way to develop intersectional consciousness. Olana and Nira have both been able to work with groups in human rights and other kinds of ally positions to think about setting intersectional agendas, and that all participants are differentially positioned. And then finally, I think we want to think very clearly about the movement. And I think that there are activists all over the world. So the Terenzina article is actually about domestic workers in Brazil, for example. There's also the National Domestic Workers Alliance in the United States that really talk about organizing in a different way that builds on intersectionality. And then last but certainly not least, of course, the discursive area, there's a lot of controversy, whether it's in the Twitterverse or other places, about how intersectionality blends into the rest of what we want to do. And so I'll wrap up there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hancock. I think Dr. Hancock raised some really important issues about looking backward, the social and political consciousness that did not start in the 1970s or 1980s, but has been with us historically. I think the important issues of visibility and the analytic project and the changing intellectual nature of intersectionality raised some really important issues about ideology and boundaries. Now we'll go to our last speaker. Jessica Danforth is the founder and executive director of the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, the first and only organization of its kind by and for indigenous youth, working across issues of sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice throughout the United States and Canada. She has spent more than half her life mobilizing individuals, families, and communities alike to reclaim their ancestral rights to self-determined decisions over their own bodies and spaces. She is the editor of 2 books, Sex Ed and Youth Colonization, Communities of Color and Sexuality, and Feminism for Real, Deconstructing the Academic Industrial Complex of Feminism. She's also currently writing sexual health articles for Indian Country Today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Danforth.
Sego, everybody. My name is Jessica Danforth, not Dr. Danforth. I would say I'm a doctor of revolutionary love, hooking up love, actually more like, but definitely, I actually have not gone to university, so I feel like the most illegitimate person up here, and I don't know why I'm here, but I hope that I'm here to sort of to share intersectionality in for what we call for real land, and so. That's all I can say about that. Yeah, I'm usually not nervous, but I'm like, fuck, I don't have any theories to cite, but I will do my best to not be so uncomfortable. But I usually am. Because I come to you from Haudenosaunee territory in Ontario and Wisconsin, and so I do want to also acknowledge myself as a visitor on this territory, in Coast Salish territory. And I also do that not as check equity box. I do that also as an Indigenous person. Just because I'm Indigenous doesn't mean that I'm not a visitor, that I don't have responsibilities. And I was thinking about what the hell am I going to say, and I asked my grandma, as I always do, about these words if I'm asked to share, because I always do feel like the most illegitimate person, because I only know what we do like in communities on the ground. But I asked her about this word, and it was a very similar conversation I had with her with the word feminism. And so when I was explaining to her what I think academics think intersectionality is, she was like, "Oh, you mean being Indian? Like you mean Indigenous? You mean like an Indigenous worldview? You mean the way that we do things?" And I was like, "Yeah," because it was very similar when I talked to her about feminism. She said, "Oh, like," I said, "Grandma, I think people want to, it's about supposedly men and women being equal as if there's only two genders." And, she was like, "Well, why do we need feminism? Women are just better. Why do we need that?" And from her perspective, she's thinking, she's not even thinking in our language. We don't even have gender pronouns. She's thinking about the governance and leadership positions that the mothers of our nations have always held. And so, I was, again, thinking, what am I going to share? And in the theme of this being looking back and looking ahead, I do think we cannot do anything justice by just citing academia. And I mean that like for real. I don't mean like you're the biggest, baddest radical faculty hire, you invite cool people to speak in your class. I mean, if we're not for real looking at intersectionality as a lived practice, like on the ground, in for real land, lived practice, we are participating in settler colonialism. That's not just a theory. That's not just something that somebody thought of. It is real, and we did it this morning as well, because we keep saying, well, we're going to cite the work of so and so. Well, why can't we cite the work of our ancestors? Why can't we cite the work of people who've survived genocide, who've survived assimilation, who've survived every single attempt to wipe us off the map? And if we have come to the point in our world, because it is the world that we're talking about, where we need academia to back up and legitimize what it is that we're doing, at what point did that change? At what point did the practice of intersectionality in for real land become something that we needed in academia to legitimize and call true, or say, well, that's academia because we can source it and we can cite it? And I think that it helps us to understand where we're complicit in just referring to academic work instead of ancestral work, because we think that we can just refer to Indigenous struggles, for example, today, instead of the Indigenous struggles, for example, that allowed us to even be in this colonized university building space in the first place. That's real. And that's how it happened. And I feel like a lot of times we engage in intersectionality avoidance of uncomfortability, meaning that we do everything we can so that we can refer to, again, academic and theoretical work rather than our own complicity, our own accountability, and not just systems, states, institutions, etc. And I mean like us participating in each other's oppression. So so after I asked my grandma, I then went to the young people that we work with. So if you're wondering like, why is a sexual health person even on this panel? And last night we were working in Portland at the Native American Family and Youth Center, and I was talking to some of the young people in our group, and they were saying, intersectionality, is that like when you're at an intersection and someone's trying to drive past you? And I was like, yeah, I guess so. And they were like, well, because, we need to stop using the word normal, because one of the young women said this best quote that I totally put on my Facebook after, which was, normal is a setting on the dryer. Normal is something that, and she's not a scholar, she's not an academic, she's not, and I'm not trying to demean or say that, real world versus academic world is more legitimate, because it's just as messed up as well. But what I am saying is that when I heard her say that last night, it reminded me of, again, the for real land that we need to be situating ourselves in and referring to, not just scholarship. Or if we're going to, at least admit it. Don't say that you are the badass community-based researcher. Say that you're an academic with privilege and use it. Don't be afraid to admit and be truthful about the stance that you're coming from, because then it makes it a lot harder for us to be like, well, why are these power dynamics happening, or why is it that you want to say you're working with the community and you're doing all these awesome things, but then you need elders to sign for honorariums. You assume people can buy their plane tickets and then get reimbursed by the university like 3 or 6 months after. But then you study all this awesome stuff, and isn't your university and your faculty awesome? No, that's the academic industrial complex really at work. So I thought, in looking back and again, in situating our ancestors' lived practices of intersectionality and naming both settler colonialism and, I also learned this very interesting academic word in the last 2 years, ahistoricity. So I learned ahistoricity from Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson, and where she says it's the willful ignorance of certain people's histories and lived experiences. So I think it's also the ahistoricity of when we think we invent shit and then we can theorize it and name it, because that's also the ahistoricity of intersectionality in practice, as well as the ahistoricity of that intersectionality in lived practice, so Canada and the United States could become countries, so that people's inherent identities could be made illegal and criminalized. And so that's really where I see myself. And I actually don't normally talk so much about my own personal self, but I feel like the going ahead of intersectionality, I can only name what I hope to do and what I hope that you will do with me, or what we can do together. So for my own story of intersectionality in practice, I knew I was an activist at the age of 10. It was this time that I saw people, I grew up in the city of Toronto, I saw people testing HIV positive. I saw people experiencing violence and getting pregnant that weren't that much older than me. And immediately I had to know why. And I learned soon after that different members of my own family had experienced these very same things. But most importantly, that they wouldn't apologize for all of the things that they had to do to survive, whether being incarcerated or having used different substances for the majority of their lives, whether trying to deal with the legacy of residential schools and intergenerational trauma and the 60 scoop. And I really wouldn't want them to either, because I am who I am today because of those things, not in spite of them. And there's a big difference between the two. And my past is in no way belittling. It's empowering because it shaped who I am, and I had the best family anybody could ever ask for. And at no point have I ever thought to myself, well, because I'm a director of an organization now, I'm better, or this is no longer my community, even after people's repeated attempts, especially in the nonprofit world, for me to tell them my sob story and tell them how awful my life was, so they better not do that. And in fact, I only know that I'm as good as these communities think that I am. And they're my home and my family, and that's actually what keeps me going and what makes me see why we have intersectionality in real life. And that's actually how I started the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. By this time in my life, I was a raging, angry 16-year-old, and I still am. Not 16, but I'm still raging and angry. Who was fed up of everyone else speaking for me, especially when health professionals kept saying that as an Indigenous, two-spirited, sometimes street-involved young woman, I was part of the so-called most at-risk demographic, which is also a phrase I see taken up just alongside marginalization when we're talking about intersectionality, that the numbers must be against me, and if I didn't turn out like the rest of them, then I would be a success, quote unquote. And of course, by virtue of a success, I would be a success if I attended a program or a workshop that deemed me a success, or that an academic theory said that I escaped marginalization in at-risk land by doing that. So at this point, I thought to myself, well, I don't live on Risk Island. I don't feel risky to myself. Why am I being called that? And whose definition is better or is more accurate of my own circumstance, theirs or mine? And what I wanted to do was actually reframe it and say, what I know that I'm at risk of isn't to myself, I'm at risk of racism, I'm at risk of colonialism, I'm at risk of poverty, I'm at risk of imperialism. And I never ever hear that when we refer to at-risk or even marginalized people. We never talk about what actually marginalizes people. We somehow imagine that they live on Marginalization Island and they didn't get pushed there. They just naturally inhabit that island. And so I thought to myself also that we shouldn't have to wait until our young people are kicked out of school, locked up, incarcerated in mental health institutions before we have for real conversations with them about things like colonialism, about things like imperialism, about things like intergenerational trauma. Why do we lock that up in academia before we have those for real conversations with the young people who experience them the most of any theory could ever prove? And I thought to myself, if we're not doing that, then we are also participating in those theories that are oppressing our next generations. And it isn't to sit a 12-year-old down, for example, and make them depressed. It's to sit down with them and say, look, this is what's going on. And not just this is what's going on, but this is why. And this is how we can change it when you know for real what's going on. You can actually do something about it. And so I thought, of all of these things, that this is where we could start in understanding what our bodies do. And so at that point, I thought, okay, well, it's all of those things, but most importantly, in moving forward for intersectionality, when I moved on into trying to understand the work that we do, I thought it is actually about It is about all of those things, but most importantly, it's having to not apologize for having an intersectional framework or for having an intersectional identity or for being an Indigenous person, for example, who has all of these things inherently. So I thought I would make a little list of some of the things that I'm not sorry for as an action we can do moving forward, and then I'm going to invite you to do the same. So one is I am not sorry for being Indigenous or Aboriginal or First Nations or Native, as well as being multiracial. My long black hair that I have many teachings from my grandmothers who still speak to me, and if I could speak my language to you right now, I could tell you more than English is also a language of the colonizer. But I don't want to be called Pocahontas because I refuse to have another white Disney story exploit my truth that Disney then capitalizes off of. So when I call myself a multiracial, Indigenous, hip-hop feminist, reproductive justice freedom fighter, and it takes people a few extra words to give me my right to self-determination of what I want to be called in the English language of the colonizer, people are just going to have to deal with that. I'm also not sorry for being a woman or a life giver and a decision maker in my community. I'm not sorry for being two-spirited, for being queer, for being bisexual, and for knowing things and concepts like sexuality and gender fabulousness, as I call myself, are also Indigenous concepts because we didn't wait for Christopher Columbus to come teach us about sex, and I'm damn proud of that. I'm not sorry for being upset that our two-spirited history, just like our intersectional history, was stomped out on purpose, because what better way to colonize or destroy a people than to take away their own history and then have institutions profit off of it or think that they invented stuff themselves. So I want you to take 30 seconds, and I want you to turn to the person next to you, for real, because this is about action moving forward if we're going to do intersectionality and for real land. First, I want you to tell the person next to you how beautiful or sexy they look today, because we can start with positive affirmations. And then what I want you to do is I want you to share what is something that you feel like you should not have to apologize for, particularly if you're going to live intersectionality in your own practice, not just in institutional walls, not just as the biggest, baddest radical faculty hire. What is something that of your own identity, in your own intersectional way or whatever, that you feel you should not have to apologize for? So we're going to take 30 seconds to do that, and then I'm going to close. Okay, so I know that we could do this potentially all day, but just in the interest of time, can we just have maybe one or two people share very quickly what is something that they feel they should not have to apologize for? So let's have somebody at the back. So I'm gonna call on my sister friend Natalie. Natalie, can you tell us something that you feel you should not have to apologize for? And just as a little quote, instead of again pointing to the intersectional work of academics, I want you to know Natalie, and I want you to look at the work that she's doing here in the city of Vancouver with racialized and newcomer youth. That's intersectional work in practice. That's Natalie. So Natalie, tell us what you're not apologizing for. So Natalie said that she doesn't apologize for being a refugee. That's awesome. And maybe, can we have one more person share? Go ahead. So I'm going to close here. Thank you, Anna. And Anna also is doing, to point to actual work here in Vancouver, Anna is also doing amazing intersectional work in practice with Indigenous young women in the city. So I want to close here just by saying that, the other thing that I've learned about intersectional theory is that, yes, it is about talking about systems of power and oppression, but I would think moving forward, we have to be very careful of when we are not only participating in settler colonialism and ahistoricity when we ignore lived practice, but when we also simply refer to intersectionality to further paternalize and pathologize people, particularly Indigenous and communities of color. And I think it is truly important for us to radicalize, or whatever you want to call that, the way we talk about intersectionality to places of strength and resiliency, so that we are the stewards of the information that goes on about us. What does it mean for us to be within these walls today, for example, at this conference, who isn't here? Sure, we can use new and hot language like intersectionality in our talk, but does that make things change in our walk? So that we aren't just saying, it's those systems of oppression and power and privilege that are harming us. It is us. We participate in each other's oppression, but it means we can also participate in each other's liberation. One of my favorite quotes from Daniel Quinn says, "The world will not be saved by old minds with new programs. If the world is to be saved, it will be with new minds with no programs at all." And when I think about the work going forward here, particularly as a young person, I'm a lot more interested in working on these issues, not as a theory, but as a way of life. Not just as a wave, but as a way of life. And not just as a generational difference, but again, as a way of life. Because when it comes down to it, we have had 7 generations of badass intersectional ancestors and activists who fought for us to be here, but we have those next 7 generations to continue to fight for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Danforth. I think with all due respect, I just want to recognize Ms. Danforth as a legitimate person, as an expert in many areas, as an expert in your strong and political social consciousness, and as an observer of your world and of our world also. I think that the issues you bring is a goal of intersectionality, which is to honor and value the lived experiences and voices of our communities. So it should not be academic work versus ancestral work. That makes me sad. I hope that we can do collaborative work. We want to thank you for reminding us of the importance of collaboration and reminding us of who should we be working with, and reminding us of the language when we use at risk. It is at risk of racism, colonialism, imperialism, and intergenerational trauma. So thank you. Now we'll open the floor for discussion. We have a number of questions, but I think we've had a very provocative and moving session this morning. So I want to first open it to the audience for questions. There are 2 mics, so please go to the mics so that everyone can hear you. And if there are no questions, I have questions, but it looks like we have one. We'll start there. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for this very exciting and stimulating, thought-provoking presentations, all of 3. So, Sirma Bilge, Université de Montréal, Québec. Maybe my question would be intended to Ange-Marie Hancock. Hello, Ange-Marie. And it will also relate to Jessica Danforth's call for it's not a system out there oppressing, but also our own practices, you know. And the question, maybe it's not wholly a question, but maybe a reaction. The setting boundaries of intersectionality, you said, Ange-Marie, is done from a point of power and not forcibly a point of disempowerment or a point of being marginalized, etc. And I was wondering if those debates are about setting the boundaries of intersectionality, or also can they be read as being self-reflexive about our own practices, our own way of trying to make intersectionality a recognized, disciplined, knowledge, recognized as a scientific truth, developing a proper methodology so that it can be. And all those endeavors, all those efforts contribute to controlling ourselves and disciplining ourselves the way intersectionality should be done. So I wondered if it is about setting boundaries of intersectionality, what is a good intersectionality, what is not intersectionality, etc., but also being self-reflexive about the call to power, aspiring to power. So this is my question, reaction.
Thank you for that question. I think the positions that I staked out were very much about re-inscribing and thinking through power rather than being as self-reflexive, and particularly because the work that I cited was very much a call to action, so a call to cite specifically Black feminists or people who are studying Black women. In particular. So the Alexander Floyd article, for example, takes me and Leslie McCall to task for kind of emblematizing this citation politics. And so, again, I will say that it was self-reflexive in that when I read that article, and again, Nicole is a colleague and a friend, that I was more self-reflexive about this idea. So I think it can spark that thinking, but I'm not sure that that work necessarily comes from that thinking. So in other words, I think that's part of what's interesting and exciting about intersectionality is that you can have these critiques even when they're coming from a friend, even when they're coming from someone that you're in solidarity with, that then encourage you to really think through well, how do I really think about this? And do I really believe that intersectionality has this multiracial, multi-ethnic, cross-generational history? And if I do, what does it mean to say that as a Black woman, as someone who others have, either looked to, and I have looked to Black women, so there's part of this historical generational line of scholars. What does it mean to say that in the presence of Patricia Hill Collins? What does it mean to say that in the presence of Elizabeth Cole? And to be able to say it's still multiracial even as I honor the fact that these women who look like me are part of how I was introduced to this work, are part of how I was, I feel comfortable in this work. Good.
Any other questions?
Hi. Hello? This question is for Jessica Danforth, but if the other two have insights, I would love to hear also. My name is Carvin Lee Chuk Fong, and I'm a non-Indigenous uninvited guest of the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Musqueam, Suquamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And my question is, in terms of academia and activists organizing and inviting people from the community to participate, what are some insights on event organizing, and perhaps more specifically when organizing in places that are open to the community and there's when there's a really noticeable difference in accessibility and also in ability, and also symbolic racialized violence and environmental racism. I'd like to get some insight on how to plan inclusively. And I'm asking this as a aspiring community organizer on the lands that I live.
So I appreciate your question. One of the things I didn't say in my little rant was that I think so, because I think a lot about allyship and solidarity, and I do wonder a lot of the time why that is self-imposed now, or self-determined instead of consensual. So there's a lot of I am your ally, or I am doing solidarity work without even asking, like, period. Like, not even, like, we would ask consent in most other situations. So, like, I work predominantly in sexual and reproductive justice, and we would ask consent of people's bodies. But I don't know why that doesn't apply to solidarity or allyship work. I also think less and less about solidarity and allyship and more about struggle, because I would say that probably the best organizing I've ever seen is when it is putting the word consent in front of allyship or solidarity, but also when it's like unsexy. Like the most amazing organizing I've seen is the people who want to like fill out the forms, who want to help people get funding, who want to set up the chairs, who don't want to be like the center of attention or the expert necessarily. And I think that also reminds me of, I don't know that we need to be inclusive so much that we need to center, because if you have to include people, it usually means that they're not there to begin with. Like, you never hear people say, we need to include more white men. Where are they? We need to go to their neighborhoods. We need to pay them honorariums. We need to recruit. We need to hire one of their own to speak to them. Like, you never hear people say that. You always hear people say that about everybody else. And so, you know, and I'm not doing like a universal application, because I think most situations are different, and we always sort of want this like magical answer of equity when it doesn't work like that, because, you know, colonialism and white supremacy don't work like that either. They're very messy and they're very different, but I do wonder about centering versus inclusion. So if we center, you know, the issues that you're talking about right now, rather than including them after the fact, it might look a little different, and it might look a little different if we can be consensual in our process, or at least be humble. Because I do wonder all the time, especially in activism, about, are we doing this because of, you know, we want to get ahead, or is it because of me, or is it because of the issues? Like, am I actually subverting the power and privilege I need to own that I have myself? And am I still able to say the uncomfortable things, or am I saying it because that's the party line and I don't want to lose my so-called allies? There are tons of examples in this type of work of where it's about people and not the issues anymore. And what does that mean, I think? And what does that mean when we don't want to give up, you know, power and privilege for the next generation? You know, when we want to wait until people can afford to be in university, et cetera, before we do this type of work with them. Or not point to the work that's happening here in Coast Salish territory as our example. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree with what Jessica said, and thinking in particular about naming the relationships of penalty and privilege, I also think we inevitably will fail if we think inclusion is the goal, right? What are we being invited to be included into, and who gets to decide? So I think we need to problematize the ideal of inclusion. Sometimes I don't want to include people in my spaces, and what does that mean as well, right? Like, so, but I think those protocols of engagement are important, and one of those for me is thinking very concretely, like who's on the organizing committee, what kinds of relationships of penalty and privilege exist, who's not at the table even having those conversations.
I actually just wanted to join this conversation. So I'm Deborah Steenstra. I hold the Nancy's Chair in Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent, and I'm part of the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women. We are in partnership with women in northern communities in Canada's near north, not the far north. And we're trying to work together from the communities to understand how to address and engage in resource extraction changes that are fundamentally altering communities. And in our practice, we are community and university alliance, but we work from an intersectional framework deliberately and intentionally. And in doing that, we've come to understand in the work that we do how very difficult doing intersectionality in practice was, and I was really glad to hear the discussions today. And one of the things that we're going to be launching today at 5 p.m. in this conference is a tool that we've co-developed with Dawn Canada, the Disabled Women's Network of Canada, that is a really practical tool, an evolving tool we called Diversity Through Inclusive Practice. So we actually choose to use inclusion as our way in. And we began because for some of us, we begin from the place of ability/disability and went much, much broader. And it's very much about event planning. It's really pragmatic. Why is this an inaccessible space to many people who are wheelchair users? Because we get put at the back of the room, right? This is a structured, exclusive way of dealing with things. And that makes people uncomfortable when I say those sorts of things, but it's just one of the structured realities. So in thinking through how to, Carvin's question of how to make events inclusive and how to really work on it, we'd like to offer you a guide. We're launching this, as I said, today at 5 p.m. In room 1530. We have very small, light refreshments because, as Olena said at the beginning, the university is extremely expensive and we're a community-based organization and don't have a lot of money, or two community-based organizations. So, and we'd really welcome your input on this. As I said, we see this as an evolving tool. It's available online in an accessible PDF form in French and English today. So we'd welcome your comments and further discussions about how to do this.
Thank you. I think we have to end our session. Just to thank our panelists for a wonderful presentation.